This video is brought to you by Gamefly.com. You can rent 8,000 new releases and classics on most major systems, all delivered right to your mailbox. If you use this URL to sign up for a free 30-day trial, you can test out their service and help support my channel. The link is in the description, so go check it out. Today, we'll be taking a look at Battlefield 1 on the PS4 and the Potato Masher. If you don't know, the Potato Masher is a $375 PC custom built in 2014, almost 2 years ago, and it is designed to compete with the PS4 for the rest of its life cycle. The goal is not to pick on consoles, but to show that PC gaming can be just as good or better for the same money. There's more info in the description, so let's get to it. Alright, buckle in for another long video. I do try to make these as short as I can since I don't want to waste your time, and I do like it when people actually watch the whole video, but some games need extra time spent on testing and evaluation, and Battlefield 1 is one of them. Let's first talk about a small change I'm going to be making in some reviews going forward. With the interesting and varied world of checkerboard upscaling, resolution supersampling, half horizontal rendering, and a variety of other ways games can be rendered to improve performance or visuals, the actual resolution a game runs at is becoming a bit of a moving target. I have no problem with any of these technologies because anytime a developer can improve performance without significant visual compromises, that means a wider range of platforms can potentially run a game and a wider range of gamers can play them. This is good. However, as a significant portion of the Potato Masher project is seeing what types of hardware it takes to match or exceed the console experience, being able to match a constantly variable experience can be a little unscientific. So moving forward with any games that feature dynamic resolution scaling, I will focus on trying to match or exceed the final image output, not necessarily the claimed maximum resolution or claimed settings. As per usual, the minimum PC system requirements for Battlefield 1 don't make any sense. The minimum Intel processor is an i5-6600K, while the minimum AMD CPU is an FX 6350. Either way, the Masher's i5-750 is well below the minimum spec. It does exceed the minimum GPUs, which are a GTX 660 or Radeon HD 7850, which are also higher than the game's true minimum requirements, but that's pretty usual. CPU usage was extremely high the entire time, even higher than in the alpha or beta. I also noticed this on my personal rig, which is running a 4790K, and numerous other people online have confirmed that CPU usage is very high or even 100% on their rigs. This will affect the Masher's performance in multiplayer, as you'll see. Let's start the visual comparison with the campaign, where I can more easily match up footage. I'm actually using a mouse to record most of the footage this time, so you'll see a little choppiness in my movements on the Masher. It feels perfectly smooth when you're playing it, but when you watch someone else play with a mouse, it can look a little jarring to some people, so just keep that in mind. With Battlefield 1 on the PS4, DICE has opted to use dynamic resolution scaling that can go over 1000p, but it never hits a full 1080p. It can supposedly go as low as 900p, and it tries to hold 60 FPS during the campaign. According to Digital Foundry's excellent analysis linked in the description, the PS4 is able to hold 60 FPS with frequent but very small drops of 1 to 3 FPS, and more rare drops of 5 to 15 FPS, with the lowest drop they tested being in the 40s during heavy action. On the Masher, I initially tried some of the graphics presets, but I don't feel they're well optimized. Some options should probably just have an on or off switch, while others can make significant differences to performance or visuals. I used PC Gaming Wiki to confirm some of my findings, and I think their optimized video settings guide is well done, so it's linked in the description if you want help with your settings too. As you can see on the screen, I'm running a mix of medium, high, and ultra settings, and I'm going to call it high, but it's not exactly the high preset. I'm also running without motion blur, as that affects performance a surprising amount, and at 60 FPS I don't think you really need it. Unless otherwise noted, all footage is at native resolution, so here I'm running the campaign at native 1080p. The frame rate is somewhat similar to the PS4, relatively stable 60 FPS with some very small drops and occasional larger ones. However, the Masher never dipped into the 40s during any part of the 4 campaign missions I played, so the Masher is running at a little bit of a higher resolution and a slightly better frame rate. But are there any other differences in the campaign? Well, surprisingly, yes. The Masher has more ground debris and more detail at distances. The battlefield looks more populated with greater numbers of fire, alpha effects like smoke, particle effects, bloom lighting, and vegetation. The Masher also has more ambient occlusion, which helps objects blend into the scenery more realistically, and it helps the lighting look more natural. None of these settings are massively different from the PS4 individually, but together they make the Masher look noticeably better in most cases. The one area I found where the masher looks worse than the PS4 is the textures. Battlefield 1 has a nifty feature that dynamically restricts VRAM usage on older cards. This is good, but some of the restrictions are more noticeable than others, and in my opinion it keeps the usage lower than it needs to be. I wouldn't mind the full 2GB of VRAM being used, allowing a few textures to be a bit sharper, but I can't really complain because VRAM performance is never an issue in the game with this setting on. So in some cases the PS4 has textures that appear to be one step higher in quality. The PS4 also has texture filtering that appears to be equivalent to the PC, which is rare for a console game, so good job DICE. Let's revisit resolution scaling for a minute. Here are some comparisons of different scaling options on the masher. I've zoomed the screen in so you can see differences more easily. A situation like this will show the differences more than during normal gameplay, as you won't be staring at diagonal lines for large portions of the campaign. While visual differences are noticeable between most settings, the game does handle it pretty well, and I think anything above 80% works well at 1080p when you're moving around. 80% is also about as low as the PlayStation 4 goes, although it doesn't have the same quality of anti-aliasing, so some things like diagonal lines appear worse than the rest of the image. I would have liked to see a sharpening option to help scaled images, but the tool does work well. After Gears of War 4, I also would have liked to see a dynamic resolution scaling option for the PC, but that's a relatively new feature, so I'm probably just being too picky. The PS4's lower resolution does hurt the image slightly, but it's not bad. The resolution is lowest when the most action is taking place, and it's at its highest when you're walking around or in slower sections. So the masher's native res does look a little bit better if you look for it, but it's not that big of a difference. So we've taken a look at the visuals during the campaign, but most people buy Battlefield 1 for the multiplayer, not for wandering around in the story. So here is where it's harder for me to remain neutral about the differences between the platforms. So let me start by saying it's commendable that DICE went for 64-player multiplayer on the PS4 to keep console owners from feeling like they're getting the cut-down experience compared to PC players. That's long been a complaint from the community, and it's nice to see it addressed. However, the PS4 experience is still worse than the PC experience, and in my opinion the difference is significant. While neither the PS4 or masher can run the campaign flawlessly, in multiplayer the PS4's experience falls off a proverbial cliff. Digital Foundry measured average frame rates in the 40s with numerous dips down to 30 FPS. The frame rate is capable of hitting 60, but only in a few scenarios and not at all consistently. For a competitive shooter with the scale and speed of Battlefield, that's not good at all. I recorded my PS4 footage before Digital Foundry's video released, but my initial seat-of-the-pants impression said the same thing. The game chugs pretty hard on the PS4 during any sequence with lots of action or destruction, which is a fair amount of the time in Battlefield. And yeah, maybe 30 or 45 FPS doesn't bother you that much, but the increase in input lag for a competitive shooter is a big deal. It feels slow and clunky when the frame rate's dipping. Now, the masher is by no means a locked 60 FPS experience either. For multiplayer, I reduced the resolution scaling to 85% to help combat the additional load on the system. Due to the extremely high CPU usage, the frame rate is almost always in the mid-50s during Conquest or Operations. During Team Deathmatch, it's usually locked at 60, but it still has a few dips to the mid-50s. I saw two short drops into the high 40s during Conquest, but they were both on the Amiens map, and I couldn't replicate that on any of the other maps. So it's absolutely not perfect, and I'm not giving the masher a pass. The multiplayer experience could be smoother. Still, mid-50s to 60 is much better than 30s and 40s. None of this factors in using a mouse instead of a controller either, which also contributes to games feeling faster. Simply put, the better multiplayer experience is on the masher, visually, and in regards to the frame rate. Speaking of that, what if 60 FPS just isn't good enough? Well, 60 FPS will have to be good enough because the masher's CPU is getting hit too hard to run much above that. Still, you guys ask, and I deliver. At native 1080p in low settings, and without VSync, the masher varied between the mid-50s and 120 FPS, but most of the time it averaged in the 60s and 70s, so that's not much of an improvement. Now, I get it, not everyone's a baller with a 1080p monitor, so I also tested 720p at low settings. Well, it got pretty much the exact same frame rate. Like I said, CPU bottleneck. Still, I don't give up that easily. Remember, the game has resolution scaling, and for some inexplicable reason, it goes as low as 25%. So here's what that looks like at 1080p. Yeah, of course it looks awful. What did you expect? It does give me a nice bump into the 80s and 90s a lot of the time, so if you have a 144Hz monitor, you can look at this ugly trash at a silky frame rate. And yes, 720p master racers, you can even drop to 25% resolution scaling at that output resolution. I'm not going to say this is playable, but PC gaming is all about choice, so if you choose to play a 2016 game that looks worse than the original Doom, then good for you, I guess. At 1440p in low settings with 70% resolution scaling, the Masher could play multiplayer at a reasonably stable 60 FPS. However, 70% is not that much better than native 1080p, so I'd only use this combination of settings if I had a native 1440p monitor and wanted the UI to remain crisp. Still, it does support it. At medium settings and 80% resolution scaling, the game still does run pretty well for multiplayer, but the frame rate drops a little bit more than I'd like and it does get into the 40s, which to be fair is the average frame rate for the PS4 in multiplayer, so it's not like the Potato Masher isn't already doing quite a bit better, but still 40s for a competitive multiplayer shooter, not ideal. In the campaign, the frame rate was also fairly consistent with a few small drops, just like at 1080p. This does look quite a bit nicer than native 1080p, and could be worth it for the campaign. Now, I wouldn't want to play multiplayer at 30 FPS, but in the campaign, the Masher can run native 1440p and the same customized high settings I used at 1080p, but at 30 FPS. I did turn on motion blur to compensate for the lower frame rate. It looks very nice, and if you're okay with 30 FPS, you might really enjoy it. 4K was not an option without reducing the resolution scaling down to 1080p equivalent, so it's not included here. With Battlefield 1, it feels a little disingenuous to complain about any aspect of the visuals in general. The latest iteration of Frostbite is frankly pretty outstandingly good looking, as also seen in last year's Battlefront. It's very demanding, but it's scalable and it still looks very respectable at lower settings as long as you have a decent CPU. So while I can definitely find and point out objective and subjective differences between the different versions of the game on different platforms, this game looks great regardless. I would really like to see a patch address the high CPU usage if possible, but it's also possible that the game really is this demanding. I'm interested in seeing what improvements the PS4 Pro version of the game might have, but as is, the Masher wins this hands down. It looks better, runs at a higher resolution, and at a consistently better frame rate. PS4 players, I honestly don't know if I'd recommend picking the game up if you're mostly interested in multiplayer. Even after the day one patch, it's rough. At least wait for another patch or two, or some confirmation from DICE that they might be able to improve the frame rate some. If the CPU usage gets addressed on PC, I might make a follow-up, or I might just wait until the Potato Masher Pro squares off against the PS4 Pro. If you enjoyed this video, check out the original build video or any of the other Potato Masher videos linked on screen. This project was started by the Casual Shenanigans Gaming Podcast, so click the link to check us out. You can support this channel and the Potato Masher project by tossing me a few bucks on Patreon. It helps me test new games quicker and better. Thank you for your support, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.